The sound was sharp, cutting, almost theatrical. Tommy Tuberville leaned back in his chair, lips curling into a grin that was too wide, too smug. And then it broke. Loose a laugh that rang through the chamber like a jeer hurled across a schoolyard. It wasn't the kind of laugh that lightens a room. It was the kind that diminishes, that sneers, that tells everyone watching. "I don't take you seriously." Cameras caught it instantly. One angle zoomed in on his face, another panned to the startled expressions of those nearby. The networks wasted no time, pushing the feed onto millions of screens. Pundits and commentators lit up their social media accounts, their words dripping with both shock and disdain. And for people watching at home, people who understood the stakes of that room, something twisted in their stomachs. Because this wasn't just a laugh. This was disrespect, casual and brazen, broadcast live. Across from him, Jasmine Crockett did not flinch. She didn't fire back, didn't roll her eyes, didn't even shift in her chair. She sat almost statuesque. Her calmness in that instant both eerie and powerful, like the surface of a lake concealing the storm beneath. Every second of her silence seemed to lengthen, stretch, and tighten the tension in the air. Tuberville laughed louder, emboldened by what he mistook for weakness, but the audience knew better. They leaned closer to their screens waiting. Was something in her eyes, a steadiness, a quiet fire that made the laughter sound less like dominance and more like the desperate noise of a man who sensed he was losing control. The narrator's voice in that moment was almost unnecessary. It echoed in the minds of those who cared about dignity, about history, about respect for sacrifice. Because this wasn't just politics. This was a cultural insult, a moment that cut deep into the American story itself. A senator laughing at a congresswoman, mocking her as though her very presence were a punchline. It was arrogance on display, and arrogance always demands a reckoning. And in that chamber, as Tuberville's smirk grew wider, no one yet realized how quickly it was about to collapse. Because in seconds, that laugh would vanish, replaced by stunned silence. What unfolded in that chamber was never just about two lawmakers sparring over policy. It was something deeper, older, stitched into the very fabric of America's story. On one side sat Tommy Tuberville, the senator who wore arrogance like a badge, his laughter echoing with a dismissiveness that cut beyond the walls of Congress. On the other sat Jasmine Crockett, her silence sharper than any retort, carrying the weight of generations who had been told to sit down, stay quiet, and accept mockery as the price of their existence. Tuberville wasn't merely laughing at a woman across the aisle. He was laughing at history itself, at sacrifice, at voices his world was never forced to reckon with. His laughter symbolized a dismissive shrug toward those who had bled, worked, and fought to carve out space in this country. It was the smug chuckle of a man who had never written a letter home from a battlefield, never faced the sting of injustice, never carried the scars of struggle. It was elitism cloaked in condescension. Crockett, by contrast, embodied something far greater than herself. She was the face of resilience, young, unbowed, unwilling to shrink in the presence of mockery. In her silence there was defiance. In her stillness there was strength. She carried with her not just her own story, but the story of families. Like hers, stories that stretch back to wars fought abroad and battles fought at home. For her, dignity was not negotiably, was inherited. Paid for in sweat and sacrifice by those who came before. This was not a routine exchange of barbs. It was a clash of symbols. Tuberville stood as the embodiment of an old guard that too often mocked what it could not understand. Crockett stood as the new generation, forged in hardship, unafraid to call arrogance by its name. His laugh was the sound of power insulated from consequence. Her composure was the echo of every silenced voice waiting for its turn to speak. And America watched, transfixed, because the stakes reached far beyond the Senate floor. Viewers at home weren't merely witnessing a petty insult. They were watching a cultural battle play out in real time. Respect for sacrifice versus the smirk of entitlement, humility versus hubris, truth versus spectacle. The question hanging in the air was not just whether Crockett would respond, but whether dignity could still triumph in an age when arrogance is so often rewarded. Tuberville, reveling in his moment, seemed certain of victory. The cameras loved His supporters, would cheer him on for the laugh alone. To him, it was already a win. But for those paying closer attention, the scene felt less like triumph and more like the careless gloating of a man who did not yet understand the weight of what was coming. Because Jasmine Crockett was not about to meet arrogance with more arrogance. She was about to reach deeper, beyond sound bites, beyond the game of political one-upmanship. She carried with her a truth too heavy to mock, too sacred to be brushed aside with a chuckle. It was a truth rooted in history, in sacrifice, in the ink of a letter written decades ago on foreign soil. And just when it seemed Tuberville owned the room, Crockett revealed the truth he could never match. To understand the weight of Tommy Tuberville's laugh, you have to understand the man behind it. His rise to power was not carved through policy, genius, military service, or even years of legislative dedication. It was born on the football field. For decades, Tuberville was known not as a lawmaker, but as a coach-and-sex sideline figurehead whose bark and bluster carried him through locker rooms and stadiums packed with roaring fans. He was brash, plain-spoken, and for many, that was enough. In the mythology of college football, he was a larger-than-life personality, but politics is not football, and the field he entered in Washington demanded more than rallying chants and easy slogans. When Tuberville ran for Senate, his campaign was fueled less by policy than by personality. He branded himself as an outsider, a straight-talker, who wouldn't get lost in the weeds of legislation. To his base, this was refreshing. To his critics, it was reckless. And almost immediately after arriving in the Senate, the cracks in his approach began to show. There were the gaffes painful, sometimes embarrassing lapses that revealed just how shallow his grasp on governance really was. He stumbled through discussions of history, confused basic facts, and delivered statements that made even his allies wince. Each time the press had a field day, and social media lit up with ridicule, but Tuberville rarely seemed rattled. He brushed it off with the same smug shrug he gave on the football field, doubling down on the idea that being real mattered more than being right. But beneath the surface, a troubling pattern was clear. He thrived on dismissiveness. Where others would show humility or correct themselves, Tuberville leaned into arrogance. He waved away critics. He mocked opponents. He played to the cheap seats, never minding how hollow it sounded to those who expected substance. The laugh that rang out at Jasmine Crockett was not an isolated moment. It was the latest in a string of jeers and taunts, the audible punctuation to a career defined more by bravado than by accomplishment. And then there was the hypocrisy, so blatant it was hard to miss. Tuberville had never worn the uniform of his country. He had never written letters from foreign soil, never felt the weight of duty that so many Americans carry in silence. Yet here he was, laughing at a woman whose very life had been shaped by sacrifice. Jasmine Crockett's father had served in Vietnam, had written home from the battlefield, had paid the price in sleepless nights and scars both visible and invisible. Tuberville's smirk, in that context, was not just arrogance, it was insult. Layered on hypocrisy, a dismissal of sacrifice from a man who had never come close to making one. For years, Tuberville had been able to rely on charm, sound bites, and a sort of blustery ignorance that his supporters found endearing. In the Senate chamber, though, the stakes were higher. His dismissiveness was no longer confined to press. Conferences or campaign rallies, it was broadcast to the nation, aimed at someone who carried with her the stories of those who had given far more than Tuberville ever had. His laughter may have seemed harmless to him, just another moment of mockery. But to the millions watching, it was the distillation of everything wrong with a politics driven by arrogance instead of respect, showmanship instead of substance. Tuberville had made a career out of belittling opponents and brushing off critics, always certain that his bluster would carry the day. He had treated governance like a game, reducing history to sound bites, sacrifice to a punchline, dignity to a target for ridicule. And for too long, arrogance had served him well. But this time, arrogance had picked the wrong opponent. Jasmine Crockett did not arrive in that chamber by accident. Her journey was not the story of privilege or shortcuts. It was the story of persistence, grit, and a refusal to be silenced in a world that too often tried to tell her she did not belong. She grew up in a home where money was tight, where opportunity wasn't handed out but fought for, piece by piece. The obstacles she faced were not just financial, but systemic, the kind that quietly remind young girls like her that the deck is stacked, that doors open wider for others while staying close to you. But even as a child, Crockett carried a spark of defiance, a voice that insisted she would not be defined by limitation. Crockett's tone grew softer, but sharper. My father came back. He built a family. He built a life. But the scars of that war never left him, and I carry them still. So when you laugh, Senator, know that you're not just laughing at me. You're laughing at him. You're laughing at every man and woman who rode home from a war zone wondering if they'd ever see their families again. You're laughing at sacrifice you've never made. For a long moment, there was no sound. No laughter, no muttering. Just silence. The kind of silence that hangs heavy because everyone knows they are witnessing something larger than politics. The networks, broadcasting live, suddenly seemed hushed, too, as if even commentators knew to stop speaking, to let the words hang. Crockett held the letter aloft, her voice unwavering. You can laugh at me all you want, but you will not laugh at my father. You will not laugh at the people who carried this nation on their backs, who bled for its freedoms, who never once asked for applause. They only asked for respect. If you can't give that, then you don't deserve the seat you're in. The chamber was still. Tuberville's hands tightened on the desk before him, his face stiff, the smirk now gone entirely. He looked not like the confident coach in command of a game, but like a man suddenly aware that the rules of this contest were different, heavier, and no longer his to dictate. Crockett folded the letter carefully, reverently, as though sealing away the echo of her father's voice. She placed it back in the folder, then raised her eyes once more. No, Senator, you may have your laugh, but I have my father's words, and words like his will outlast every smirk, every jeer, every hollow taunt from men who never paid the price. The effect was electric. Social media, already alive with outrage, now erupted with reverence. Clips of her reading the letter spread. Instantly, hashtags forming in real time. Hashtag CROCKETTS letter. Hashtag silenced by sacrifice. On veterans forums, comments flooded in men and women who had served, recognizing the authenticity. The pain, the truth in her words. In the chamber, though, it was quieter than it had ever been. Eyes remained fixed on Crockett, some brimming with respect, others with discomfort. Tuberville avoided her gaze, shifting slightly, the confidence drained from his posture. He had walked into the moment with laughter. He now sat trapped in silence, a silence he could not command, silence that belonged entirely to her. Jasmine Crockett didn't need to say anything else. The letter had done the work. Her father had spoken across decades, across generations, silencing arrogance with the raw weight of sacrifice. And in that moment, the chamber understood. This was not just debate, not just politics, not just a clash of personalities. This was history itself rising up in defense of dignity. Her words, her father's words, had transcended the chamber. They had reached into living rooms, into smartphones, into the hearts of those who watched. People who had felt dismissed, diminished, mocked, now saw themselves reflected in her strength. They saw arrogance collapse, not with shouting, not with insults, but with dignity carried forward from a soldier's letter written in the dust of war. And as the silence held, the truth was undeniable. America had just witnessed arrogance collapse in real time. The silence inside the chamber lasted only a few seconds, but outside those walls, the impact was immediate. As soon as Jasmine Crockett finished reading her father's words, the digital world erupted. Clips of her calm and deliberate delivery spread across every platform within minutes. By the time she set the letter down, the moment was already trending nationwide. On TikTok, creators replayed the exact second Tuberville's smirk vanished. Layering the clip with dramatic music and captions like a knockout blow had just landed. Teenagers who had never watched a congressional hearing posted reactions, saying this is how dignity defeats arrogance. On X, political commentators declared that Crockett had turned silence into strength, and that Tuberville's laugh had already aged badly. YouTube channels uploaded montages with titles calling the exchange one of the most powerful moments in Congress. Views soared into the hundreds of thousands before the day was over. Everywhere the video appeared, people stopped to watch. Veterans groups moved quickly too. National organizations issued statements praising Crockett for honoring the dignity of service and sacrifice. Local veterans coalitions shared their support, saying she had spoken for countless families who had lived through the same uncertainty and pain reflected in her father's words. For many of them, it was personal.
Ow!
They saw in her letter the echoes of their own. Tuberville's laugh, once confident, now became a running joke. The clip of him leaning back and chuckling was looped endlessly, followed by the silence that froze him in place. Meme pages had a field day. One viral edit replayed his smirk again and again before cutting to Crockett's steady voice. Another froze his face mid-laugh, with captions calling it the moment Arrogance ended. Cable news gave the exchange wall-to-wall coverage. Anchors replayed the footage, slowing it down, dissecting each turn of the moment. Commentators pointed out how Crockett had shifted the entire power dynamic without ever raising her voice. What she delivered was not a clapback, not a quick one-liner, but a story rooted in sacrifice. The Washington Post framed it as a collision between arrogance and dignity. Even conservative-leaning outlets could not ignore the raw power of her words. Ordinary Americans joined in. Comment threads filled with stories from sons and daughters of veterans. People posted pictures of letters their own fathers and mothers had written home from Vietnam, Korea, and Iraq. They saw themselves in her. They saw their sacrifices honored in her father's words. For them, the moment felt bigger than politics. It was recognition. The reactions spread into everyday life. In group chats, in coffee shops, in workplaces, people replayed the clip, showing friends and family. Teachers began sharing it with students as an example of composure and moral courage. Activists held it up as proof that truth can still break through noise. Tuberville tried to downplay it in interviews, saying people were exaggerating, but the footage told a different story. His laugh had been caught, silence had been broadcast. And no denial could change the fact that millions had seen him shrink before the weight of history. Late-night shows picked it up as well. Hosts replayed the clip and audiences roared when Crockett's words cut the laughter to silence. Musicians sampled her speech in remixes. Artists sketched her holding the letter as if it were a shield. The cultural echo kept growing. Crockett's moment reminded people that politics is not only about votes and speeches, but about the stories we carry as a nation. Her father's sacrifice had reached across decades, silencing arrogance in real time. What began as a senator's laugh ended as a lesson in respect that resonated far beyond Washington. But this was more than a viral clip. It became a cultural moment. Jasmine Crockett did not simply win an exchange in a congressional chamber. She reframed the entire debate. What had started as a senator's mocking laugh transformed into a lesson about what America chooses to value. On one side was arrogance, a smirk that sought to belittle. On the other was sacrifice, spoken through. The steady voice of a daughter carrying her father's words from a battlefield long past. In that moment, the contrast could not have been sharper. Tuberville had leaned on derision, trying to reduce politics to a game of sound bites and swagger. Crockett answered with history, with memory, with the weight of lives lived and lost. She reminded the nation that true strength is not loud, not mocking, not careless. True strength comes from dignity, humility, and the willingness to honor those who carried burdens heavier than laughter could ever dismiss. The chamber itself seemed to understand. Lawmakers who had shifted uncomfortably during Tuberville's taunts now leaned back, absorbing the gravity of what they had just witnessed. Some nodded. Some stayed silent, not out of dismissal, but out of respect. The energy of the room was no longer laughter, no longer arrogance. It was reverence. For viewers at home, the lesson stretched beyond the walls of Congress. Parents sat with their children and explained what the letter meant. Veterans who had long felt unseen watched Crockett speak and felt, perhaps for the first time in years, that their sacrifices still carried meaning. Young people scrolling through their phones saw that politics was not always about shouting matches or partisan noise. Sometimes it was about something deeper, about choosing respect over ridicule. The moral of the moment was simple yet profound. Laughter fades. Sacrifice endures. Tuberville's laugh would echo briefly across social media, turned into memes and punchlines. But Crockett's words, rooted in her father's service, carried the permanence of truth. They could not be mocked away. They stood as testimony to a different kind of power, the kind that survives decades, the kind that binds generations, the kind that humbles. Arrogance. Without ever raising its voice, this was no longer about two politicians trading blows. It was about America asking itself a question. Do we want to be a nation that rewards mockery and swagger, or one that honors sacrifice and resilience? Do we choose arrogance, or do we choose dignity? Every viewer, every citizen, was pulled into that choice. And for many, the answer was clear. Crockett's calm reframed the meaning of power. She showed that composure could silence cruelty, that memory could outlast noise, that truth could pierce through arrogance. She reminded the nation that respect, her father played a central role in shaping that fire. He had been drafted as a young man into the Vietnam War, thrown into a conflict he neither sought nor fully understood. Like so many others, he wrote letters, home letters filled with contradictions that only soldiers can know. There was pain in his words, a longing for the life he had left behind. There was pride, too, in serving a country that had demanded his youth. And beneath it all, there was sacrifice, unglamorous, the kind that scars families for decades. Those letters became heirlooms in the Crockett household, not just ink on paper, but reminders that dignity is born from endurance. As Jasmine grew, those letters became part of her identity. She learned early that her father's story was not isolated. It was the story of countless men and women, especially from working class and minority communities, who were asked to give everything, while receiving so little in return. She absorbed the lesson that respect is not optional, that sacrifice demands acknowledgement, and that silence in the face of mockery is complicity. These lessons hardened into values that would guide her into law and eventually politics. When she entered law school, Jasmine knew exactly what she was walking into. She would be one of the few, carrying both the weight of expectation and the sting of skepticism. Professors doubted her, peers underestimated her, but each doubt became fuel. She focused her energy on cases that revealed the cracks in America's promises, cases where systemic injustice suffocated the vulnerable, where voices went unheard unless someone fought to amplify them. She stood in courtrooms on behalf of those who could not stand for themselves, channeling not just her education but the resilience she had inherited from her father's story. Every victory was personal. Every loss was a reminder that the fight was larger than her. In those moments, she could almost hear her father's voice from the letters, steady, resigned but unwavering. He had endured because he had no choice. She would endure because she refused to accept the world as it was. And slowly her reputation grew, a fighter, a straight talker, a woman who did not flinch when the powerful tried to mock her into silence. By the time she entered Congress, Crockett had already lived a lifetime of battles. Stakes of every word spoken on that floor. For her, politics was never theater. It was survival, justice, the continuation of sacrifices that could not be erased. She carried with her the stories of her community, the pain of her childhood, and, above all, the ink of her father's letters that had reminded her, over and over, that dignity is worth more than comfort, that truth is worth more than applause. So when Tommy Tuberville laughed, when his dismissiveness rang across the chamber, Crockett did not hear the laugh of a single man. She heard the echo of every voice that had ever tried to belittle her, every smirk aimed at silencing her, every institution that thought it could bury her story beneath its arrogance. She felt her father in that moment, the young man drafted into a war he didn't choose, the soldier who gave what Tuberville never had to give. And she knew what she had to do. The audience watching couldn't see it yet. They only saw her calm, her steady gaze, the stillness that made Tuberville believe he had won. But beneath that calm was the fire of generations, the conviction of a daughter who had carried her father's words in her heart like armor. She was not just Jasmine Crockett, Congresswoman. She was Jasmine Crockett, daughter of sacrifice, fighter of injustice, heir to a story that Arrogance could never erase, and that's when she reached for the letter that would change everything. Tuberville leaned forward, emboldened by the sound of his own laughter. He wasn't finished. With the cameras rolling and the crowd watching, he pushed harder, as if the smirk on his face demanded more fuel. He tossed out a dismissive remark, waving his hand as though Crockett's presence in the chamber were nothing more than an inconvenience. To him, this was sport, a chance to play the swaggering coach again, to rile the opponent and get a rise. But Crockett did not give him that satisfaction. She didn't roll her eyes, didn't exchange whispers with allies, didn't even shift. In her chair, she simply met his gaze, calm and steady, like a shoreline waiting for the tide to crash. Her silence wasn't weakness, it was strategy. And the more she refused to flinch, the louder his arrogance became. Tuberville doubled down, mocking with the kind of dismissive tone that revealed more about him than it ever could about her. He cracked jokes under his breath, enough for the microphones to catch, enough to keep the cameras trained on him. To his supporters, it looked like confidence. But to those watching closely, it was something else, a man overplaying his hand, blind to the danger of his own hubris. The chamber felt the shift. Conversations that had hummed quietly around the room began to fade. Murmurs rose, not of approval, but of discomfort, like a crowd sensing a storm rolling in. Staffers exchanged uneasy glances. Lawmakers leaned forward in their seats as if anticipating. The collision everyone now knew was inevitable. The laughter, once sharp, began to echo hollow against the stone walls, reverberating not as strength, but as noise. Crockett remained motionless, but her composure carried weight. Every second she sat in silence was a second Tuberville grew more restless, more desperate to assert control. He didn't see it, but the audience did. Viewers at home, scrolling through their phones, tweeting their outrage, felt the tension, tightening like a coil ready to snap. The power dynamic was shifting, slowly, silently, in Crockett's favor. It was the kind of moment that reveals character. Tuberville, with no service, no sacrifice, laughed and sneered, clinging to bravado as though it were armor. Crockett, forged in struggle, anchored by her father's story, held her silence like a weapon she had not yet unsheathed. One man mocked, because he knew nothing else. One woman waited because she knew the truth was stronger than any jeer. The room was no longer Tuberville's playground. It was a stage, and the performance he thought he was leading had already slipped from his grasp. The murmurs grew louder. Journalists in the press gallery scribbled faster, sensing a headline in the making. The air thickened, charged, every second, stretching longer than the last. Tuberville grinned, oblivious to the shift. He thought he had landed the blow. He thought his laugh would linger, that his mockery would define the moment. He did not realize. He was writing the prelude to his own undoing, because Jasmine Crockett had not even begun to speak. The audience could feel it. They could see it in her eyes, the patience of someone who knew her words would not just cut, but carve. When she finally chose to break her silence, she would not need to raise her voice. She carried with her something he could never touch, something rooted in sacrifice, something that mocked his arrogance without ever trying. The smirk on his face was about to disappear. The chamber was still buzzing with Tuberville's laughter when Jasmine Crockett finally moved. Slowly, deliberately, she reached into the folder resting on the desk before her. Her hands did not tremble. They were steady, precise, as if she knew the weight of what she was about to reveal. The chatter softened, the murmurs stilled. The moment stretched like the air before a storm. She lifted a folded page. Worn with time, the ink faded, but not forgotten. For a brief second, she held it without speaking, letting the silence reclaim the room. And then, with a voice low but resonant, she began, "My father," she said, her words deliberate, "was drafted to fight in Vietnam. He didn't ask to go, didn't choose to leave his home, his family, his future. But he went because his country demanded it. And while he was there, he wrote letters. Letters that my family has kept to this day." Tuberville's grin faltered, if only slightly. The laughter that had seemed so easy moments earlier now had nowhere to land. Crockett glanced down at the page, her voice steady. In one of those letters, he wrote, "Asterisk, you don't know if I'll make it back. But if I don't, I want you to know that I gave everything I could. I want you to know I was proud to serve, even when the world felt broken, even when it felt like no one saw us. My hope is that someday, my children will live in a country that respects every sacrifice, no matter who it comes from." Asterisk, the room froze. Every word cut through the air, sharp against the memory of Tuberville's mocking laugh. Crockett didn't raise her voice, didn't dramatize the cadence. She didn't need to. The gravity of her father's words carried all the weight necessary. She looked up, locking her gaze on Tuberville. "This is what sacrifice looks like, Senator. This is what dignity sounds like. My father didn't get to sit in these chairs, wearing a suit, mocking others. He was fighting in a jungle thousands of miles away, hoping to make it home. And for you to laugh at me, for you to laugh at anyone while carrying nothing of that history in your own life, is not strength. It's weakness." A hush fell across the chamber. Eyes that had been darting nervously only moments before were now fixed on her. Lawmakers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Staffers stopped, mid-note, their pens hanging in the air. The cameras zoomed in, catching the hard lines of Tuberville's face as his smirk slipped into something tighter, something uncertain.